"Mister, are you my dad?" That question hung in the air, thick with the hospital's disinfectant smell at 2:47 in the morning. Like a bullet driving straight into Knox Mercer's chest, he stood rooted to the floor, staring at the two 7-year-old girls trembling in front of him, long black hair brushing their shoulders, gray eyes like the Chicago sky before a storm. The exact eyes of the woman he had been searching for 7 years. "Your voice sounds like the recordings on Mom's phone," one of them whispered, her words shaking. "The saved messages Mom listens to whenever she cries." Knox's hands started to tremble. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man who made the entire underworld bow its head, was trembling because of two 7-year-old children, two beautiful, terrified children who had called him in the middle of the night because their mother had suddenly collapsed. They were looking at him as if he held every answer in the world. And maybe he did. Maybe the answer was already written across their faces, in the hard angle of a jaw, in the way they tilted their heads when they thought, in the stubborn look that refused to cry, even while they were afraid, just like him. "We think," the other one spoke up, her voice threaded with a fragile mix of hope and fear. "We think you're our dad." And Knox Mercer, mafia boss, man who held the lives of hundreds in his hands, felt his empire beginning to crumble because the math was too simple. 7 years old, 7 years ago, the truth was too clear. And the woman who had vanished from his life 7 years earlier without a single explanation had been carrying his children when she ran. The staggering weight of that truth completely shattered the last remaining walls of his cold, untouchable armor. Knox did not hesitate, and he did not care about the terrified hospital staff watching him. The ruthless king of the Chicago syndicate slowly dropped to his knees on the cold linoleum floor, completely surrendering to the two fragile girls as he pulled them into his chest. His expensive tailored suit absorbed their silent tears, and his strong arms wrapped around their fragile frames like a fortress of absolute protection. Violet buried her face against his collar and sobbed openly while Luna stood stiff for only a second before melting into his fierce embrace. He pressed his face into their dark hair and inhaled the scent of cheap soap and innocent fear. For 7 agonizing years, he had lived as a ghost in a mansion made of blood and money. He had built an empire of shadows and violence just to numb the gaping hole Alara had left behind. Now the pieces of his shattered soul were breathing against his chest and calling him father. He squeezed his eyes shut and felt the first hot tear trace down his scarred cheek. He swore a silent vow in that suffocating hospital corridor that he would burn the entire city to ash before he let them go again. 30 minutes before that life-altering embrace, the freezing South Side apartment had been entirely silent. Alara Sinclair pushed open the broken front door after working her 3rd consecutive shift of the day. Her muscles screamed in agony and her stomach twisted with a hollow ache that she had learned to ignore. The cramped walls of the tiny room felt like a suffocating cage built entirely of debt and despair. She had inherited a crushing burden of $120,000 in medical bills when her mother died, and the ruthless collection agencies never stopped calling. Every single cent she earned from scrubbing floors and waiting tables went to keeping the heat on and putting cheap noodles on the table for her daughters. She walked into the kitchen and opened the empty refrigerator to find only half a loaf of stale bread and a splash of milk. She swallowed her own hunger and poured the milk into 2 small glasses for the twins so they would not wake up with empty stomachs. But as she reached for the counter to steady her shaking legs, the world suddenly tilted violently. Her vision blurred into a sea of static and her exhausted heart skipped a heavy beat. Alara collapsed onto the hard kitchen tiles and her head struck the sharp edge of the cabinet with a sickening crack. The loud thud echoed through the dark apartment and woke the twins instantly. Luna sat up in the freezing bedroom and dragged her frightened sister toward the kitchen where they found their mother lying completely motionless on the floor. A thin trail of dark blood seeped from Alara's temple and stained the cracked white tiles. Violet began to scream and cry uncontrollably, but Luna forced herself to swallow her own terror. The 7-year-old girl knew they could not afford an ambulance, but she also knew her mother was not waking up. Luna ran to the small closet and dug beneath a pile of old sweaters until her small fingers found the hidden wooden box her mother always cried over. She pried off the lid and grabbed the worn business card resting the side of faded photograph of a man with storm gray eyes. Her hands shook violently as she punched the number into her mother's cracked phone and waited for the terrifying stranger to pick up. She did not know she was dialing the most dangerous man in the city, but she knew he was their only hope. When the deep voice answered on the third ring, Luna swallowed her tears and begged the stranger to come save them. Knox pulled back from the memory of that frantic phone call and wiped the tears from Violet's cheeks. The sharp click of approaching footsteps broke the heavy silence as a pale doctor in a white coat approached the waiting area with a clipboard. Knox stood up to his full height, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly from a broken father back to a lethal kingpin. The doctor nervously explained that Alara had suffered a severe collapse from chronic malnutrition and an undiagnosed ruptured ovarian cyst that required immediate and highly complex surgery. The young physician stammered about insurance protocols and limited staff availability at this early hour. Knox stepped forward and grabbed the doctor by the collar of his white coat with terrifying speed. He did not yell, but his voice dropped to a lethal whisper that promised absolute destruction if his orders were ignored. He commanded the hospital administrator to wake up the absolute best surgical team in the entire state of Illinois and bring them to the operating room within 10 minutes. He pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from his pocket and threw it onto the nurse's station to cover every conceivable cost. The terrified medical staff scrambled into a frenzy of action as the silent king of Chicago took total control of the hospital wing. With Alara finally secured in the hands of elite surgeons, Knox returned to the hard plastic chairs and pulled his daughters onto his lap. The adrenaline began to fade, and the crushing reality of their living conditions settled heavily onto his chest. He asked Luna to tell him everything about their daily lives, and the words she spoke sliced through his heart like a serrated blade. Luna spoke in a quiet voice about how their mother worked 20 hours a day and still could not afford new winter coats. Violet chimed in and explained how Alara always claimed she was not hungry at dinner time just so the twins could eat the last scraps of food on their plates. They told him about the freezing apartment with the broken heater and the terrifying nights when the debt collectors pounded their fists against the thin wooden door. Knox clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth threatened to crack under the immense pressure of his own self-hatred. He lived in a sprawling mansion filled with imported marble and private chefs, while the woman he loved starved herself into a coma to keep his children alive. He realized Alara had traded her own life to protect his daughters from a world she believed was too dangerous. Knox stared down at the two fragile girls sleeping against his chest and silently prepared for a war that would change everything. Alara slowly dragged herself out of the heavy anesthetic fog, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the recovery room pierced her vision. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile white room until she opened her eyes completely. A tall silhouette stood at the foot of her hospital bed like a shadow carved from solid ice. Knox Mercer was staring down at her with storm-gray eyes that held 7 years of frozen agony. The sterile air instantly turned thick and suffocating inside her lungs. Panic clawed up her throat, and her weak hands gripped the thin white sheets as if they could shield her from the most dangerous man in Chicago. He did not wear the warm smile of the man she had loved 9 years ago. He stood there like the ruthless king of the underworld she had run away from. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles feathered beneath his scarred skin, and his large hands were curled into violent fists at his sides. He had found her. Why? Knox asked, and his deep voice was a lethal whisper that made the heart monitor spike erratically. He took one slow step closer to the edge of the bed, and the sheer gravity of his presence seemed to crush the oxygen out of the room. 7 years you hid my flesh and blood in a freezing slum while you starved yourself into a hospital bed. Alara tried to push herself up, but her exhausted body refused to obey her terrified mind. I had to protect them, she choked out, and hot tears immediately spilled over her pale cheeks. Knox slammed his hand down on the metal bed rail, and the violent sound echoed like a gunshot. Protect them from what? He demanded with a cold fury that stripped the breath from her lungs. I could have given them the entire world, and you chose to let them freeze in the dark. The accusation felt like a physical blow to her chest, because she knew exactly how much her daughters had suffered. But she had made the only choice a terrified mother could make when faced with absolute destruction. I was protecting them from you. Alara cried out, and her voice broke into a desperate sob that forced Knox to freeze in place. She closed her eyes, and the nightmare from 7 years ago dragged her back into the dark cafe where everything had shattered. Your Uncle Raymond found me 3 weeks after I ran away from your apartment. Knox went completely rigid, and his storm gray eyes widened by a fraction of an inch. I had just found out I was pregnant, and I was actually going to come back to tell you, she whispered through her tears. But Raymond cornered me in the back booth, and he brought a thick manila folder filled with glossy photographs. She began to tremble violently as the phantom images burned behind her eyelids. He showed me pictures of a beautiful young woman and a tiny baby lying in a pool of blood. Knox stopped breathing, and his hands slowly uncurled as the horrifying truth began to dawn on him. Raymond told me that was what happened to the last woman who tried to trap you with a child. Alara sobbed, and she looked up into Knox's devastated eyes. He told me children were a lethal weakness in your world, and Knox Mercer destroyed his weaknesses. Alara wiped the tears from her chin and forced herself to hold the gaze of the terrifying mafia boss. He said you already knew I was pregnant, and you had sent him to clean up the mess. Knox took a stumbling step backward, as if her words had physically hollowed out his chest. Raymond gave me 1 hour to pack a bag and vanish off the face of the earth. She continued with a quiet and resilient strength. He promised he would send a hit squad to butcher me and my unborn babies if I ever tried to contact you again. The chilling confession hung heavy in the sterile hospital room and completely shifted the axis of Knox's world. The blinding rage he had aimed at the woman he loved instantly redirected toward the man who shared his blood. Alara had not run because she hated him or wanted to steal his children. She had sacrificed her entire youth and starved herself to the brink of death just to keep his daughters breathing. Knox looked at the fragile woman in the hospital bed, and a terrifying new darkness swallowed his storm gray eyes. He turned his back on her and walked toward the door with the slow and heavy steps of an executioner. Knox stationed a dozen heavily armed men outside Alara's hospital room before he walked out into the freezing Chicago night. He did not let the blinding rage consume his mind. He channeled it into a cold and calculated weapon instead. Within exactly 1 hour, he assembled a tactical strike team of 20 elite enforcers. They moved through the darkness like a swarm of silent shadows and descended upon his uncle's heavily fortified estate. The outer gates were breached in less than 10 seconds, and the perimeter guards surrendered without firing a single shot. Raymond Mercer had built a fortress to protect his stolen wealth, but he had never prepared for the wrath of a betrayed father. Knox kicked open the heavy oak doors of the master study and found the traitor sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk. Raymond looked up with wide and terrified eyes as the 20 armed men flooded into his sanctuary. The old man realized in a single heartbeat that his 7 years of treacherous lies had finally caught up to him. There would be no quick and merciful execution tonight. Knox was far more ruthless than a simple bullet to the head. He ordered his men to drag Raymond out from behind the desk and force him into a hard wooden chair. Knox tossed a thick leather folder onto the desk and forced his uncle to open it. The documents inside detailed the systematic dismantling of Raymond's entire illicit empire. Knox had already seized his shipping routes and burned his underground casinos to the ground. Then Knox pulled out a secure phone and made one very brief call to his offshore bankers. He watched the blood drain from his uncle's face as $160 million vanished from Raymond's secret accounts in a matter of seconds. Knox stripped the traitor of his money and his power and his dignity with terrifying precision. The older man slumped forward and wept like a broken child as his life's work evaporated into thin air. The heavy iron doors of the study suddenly echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps. Knox turned and felt the breath catch in his throat as Alara walked slowly into the ruined sanctuary. She had refused to stay confined to her hospital bed and demanded the guards bring her directly to the compound. Her pale skin was practically glowing against the dark fabric of a borrowed coat, but her storm-gray eyes burned with a fierce and unyielding fire. Two armed men walked closely behind her to ensure she did not stumble on the polished marble floor. Knox immediately stepped forward and wrapped a protective arm around her fragile waist. He wanted to shield her from the ugliness of his world, but he knew she needed this moment of absolute closure. Alara stood tall and stared down at the trembling man who had stolen 7 years of her life. She was no longer the terrified 21-year-old girl who had run crying into the snow. She was a mother who had fought the entire world to keep her children breathing, and she had won. "You took 7 years away from me," Alara said, and her voice did not shake at all. Raymond slowly lifted his head and stared at the ghost he thought he had buried long ago. "You made me starve and you made my children freeze because you thought love was a weakness," she continued with absolute clarity. "But you are the weak one because you only understood money and fear." Raymond opened his mouth to speak, but the suffocating weight of his total ruin silenced him completely. Alara leaned slightly closer and delivered the final blow to his shattered ego. "I survived your threats and my daughters survived the slums, and now Knox knows the truth," she whispered into the quiet room. "You have absolutely nothing left and we have everything." She turned her back on the ruined traitor and did not even bother to look back as she walked out of the room. Knox ordered his men to throw the destitute old man onto the freezing streets of Chicago with nothing but the clothes on his back. The nightmare was finally over and the king had violently reclaimed his queen. Knox did not give Alara a choice about where she would recover after the hospital released her. The armored black convoy rolled through the iron gates of his sprawling Chicago estate exactly 3 days later. The multi-million-dollar fortress sat hidden behind towering stone walls and dozens of armed guards walking the perimeter. Alara stepped out of the heavy vehicle and stared at the imposing marble columns with a deep sense of dread settling in her stomach. She had spent 7 long years fighting for every single breath, and this suffocating luxury felt like a beautifully decorated prison. The massive front doors opened to reveal a cavernous foyer dripping with imported crystal chandeliers and polished gold fixtures. Knox walked beside her with a quiet pride, but Alara crossed her thin arms tightly over her chest to shield herself. She did not see a safe sanctuary in these echoing halls, and she did not care about the priceless art on the walls. She only saw the lethal empire that had almost cost her everything she loved in this world. And she absolutely refused to let this dark world swallow her daughters. The simmering tension exploded on their very first night inside the gilded cage. Knox had filled a massive master suite with thousands of dollars in designer clothes and priceless jewelry just for her. Alara looked at the delicate silk dresses and immediately turned her burning gray eyes onto the dangerous mafia boss. "I am not a pet you can keep in a cage," she told him with a voice like sharpened steel. "I am not a desperate girl you can buy with expensive fabric and a warm bed." She made it absolutely clear that she was only staying inside his fortress until her physical wounds were fully healed. She promised him that she would take her daughters and walk right out the front door the moment she could stand on her own 2 feet. Knox clenched his jaw and fought the violent urge to lock the heavy iron gates forever to keep her safe. He hated her stubborn refusal to accept his protection, but he secretly worshipped the unbreakable fire blazing in her soul. He agreed to her terms with a slow nod, but he silently vowed to make her choose to stay. The twin girls reacted to their massive new world in completely opposite ways as the first week passed. Violet bloomed instantly inside the absolute safety of the guarded stone walls. Knox gave her a bedroom the size of her entire old apartment and filled it with every color of professional paint imaginable. The traumatized little girl who used to cry in the freezing dark was suddenly painting brilliant murals across her pristine white walls. She ran through the sprawling corridors with bright laughter and easily wrapped her small arms around Knox's massive legs when he returned from his violent meetings. "Look what I made, Dad," she would say with a pure and innocent trust that made the ruthless kingpin completely melt. Every time Violet smiled at him, he felt another frozen piece of his dark soul slowly thaw and break away. He bought her endless blank canvases and spent hours just watching her mix bright yellow suns and deep blue oceans on her palette. For the first time in his violent life, he understood what it truly meant to build something beautiful instead of destroying it. But Luna was a completely different kind of survivor, and she did not trust the sudden influx of wealth. She did not care about the massive bedrooms or the endless buffet of expensive food cooked by private chefs. She navigated the sprawling mansion with the cold and calculating eyes of a South Side street soldier looking for an ambush. She flatly refused to call Knox her father, and she watched his every move from the deep shadows of the estate. She found an antique mahogany chess set in the massive library and challenged the mafia boss to a silent game. Knox expected to play a simple match with a 7-year-old child, but he was entirely wrong. Luna played with a ruthless and brilliant strategy that forced the underworld king to focus every ounce of his intellect on the board. She sacrificed her own pieces just to trap his king, and she stared at him with gray eyes that were entirely too old for her small face. She was testing his mind and his patience with every single calculated move on the board. The heavy silence of the library was finally broken during their 5th consecutive match. Luna slid her black knight across the polished wood and looked directly into Knox's scarred face. "Do you just want us because you need an heir for your empire?" she asked him with a chillingly calm voice. The blunt question hit Knox like a physical punch to the chest because it revealed exactly how much trauma she carried. He looked at his brilliant daughter and realized she possessed the exact same cynical mind that kept him alive on the lethal streets of Chicago. He did not lie to her or offer her sweet promises that a bruised child would never believe. "I do not care about the empire," Knox swore with raw honesty. "I want you here because you are my blood, and I will burn everything I own to the ground before I let anyone hurt you again." Luna did not smile, and she did not call him Dad, but she slowly nodded her head in silent understanding. She moved her next chess piece forward, and Knox knew he had just survived her first deadly test. Knox Mercer had built his entire empire on absolute punctuality and terrifying control. But the dark underworld of Chicago did not care about a 7-year-old girl's school art show. A massive weapons shipment from the Eastern Syndicate suddenly went sideways at the docks. Gunfire erupted in the freezing rain, and Knox had to personally intervene to stop a full-scale gang war. He looked at his gold watch and realized he was going to miss Violet's exhibition. The little girl had spent 3 entirely sleepless nights painting a beautiful portrait of their new family. Knox felt a sharp sting of guilt, but he fell back on the only language he truly understood. He called his right-hand man and ordered him to deliver a $10,000 custom art set directly to the school. He thought the expensive imported paints and solid oak easels would somehow make up for his empty chair. He was dead wrong. The heavy oak doors of the mansion echoed loudly when Knox finally returned home hours past midnight. He expected to find the house completely asleep, but the grand living room was brightly lit. Violet was curled up into a tiny ball on the massive leather sofa, and her eyes were swollen red from crying. The $10,000 art set sat on the floor completely unopened and ignored. Luna stood directly in front of her weeping sister like a small and fierce guardian. The older twin locked her storm gray eyes onto Knox, and her gaze was colder than the Chicago winter. "You promised her you would be there," Luna stated with a voice that cut through the silent room like a razor. Knox stopped in his tracks, and the intimidating mafia boss suddenly felt incredibly small. He tried to explain the emergency, but Luna did not let him finish his sentence. "A box of expensive paints does not sit in a chair and clap when her name is called," the 7-year-old girl snapped. Luna took a step closer, and her small fists were clenched tightly at her sides. Mom worked 3 exhausting jobs and her feet bled every single night. Luna continued with a ruthless and stinging clarity. "But she never once missed a school play or a parent meeting because she actually cared about us." The brutal comparison completely shattered Knox's hardened ego. He realized he was trying to buy his daughter's love the exact same way he bought off corrupt politicians. He had survived bullets and betrayals, but his own child had just exposed his deepest failure. Knox did not offer another empty excuse, and he did not try to defend his violent actions. The most feared man in the city slowly dropped to his knees on the imported Persian rug. He crawled forward until he was at eye level with the heartbroken little girl on the sofa. "I was wrong," Knox whispered, and his voice cracked with genuine remorse. Knox reached out and gently wiped a fresh tear from Violet's pale cheek. "I let my dark world become more important than you, and that will never happen again," he promised with a fierce and absolute certainty. He pulled Violet into his chest and let her cry into his ruined designer shirt. He swore to her that he would burn his entire shipping business to the ground before he ever missed another moment of her life. Violet slowly wrapped her small arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. She forgave him with the pure and unconditional love that Knox knew he absolutely did not deserve. He held her tightly and looked up at Luna standing over them. The older twin still had her arms crossed, but the icy barrier in her gray eyes had finally begun to crack. She did not smile or offer any sweet words of comfort. But Luna took one slow step forward and gently rested her small hand on Knox's broad shoulder. It was a silent truce, and the dangerous kingpin finally understood the true currency of a family. The sprawling Chicago estate finally fell completely silent after midnight. Alara stood alone on the massive stone balcony and let the freezing wind bite through her thin silk robe. She stared out at the glittering city skyline, but her mind was entirely consumed by the violent mafia boss sleeping down the hall. Soft footsteps echoed against the stone, and Knox stepped out into the freezing air to stand beside her. He did not wear his intimidating tailored suit or carry his usual lethal aura. He just looked like a deeply exhausted man who had spent 7 years searching for a ghost. The heavy silence stretched between them until Knox finally broke it with a raw and quiet confession. He told her he had kept their old tiny apartment completely untouched for 3 entire years after she vanished. He paid the rent every single month and left her paintbrushes exactly where she had dropped them on the kitchen counter. He admitted he could not bear to let her go, and the brutal reality of his lonely empire had slowly crushed his soul. "I never touched another woman," Knox whispered, and his deep voice trembled slightly in the cold air. "I tried to force myself to move on, but every single face I looked at was yours, and it completely ruined me for anyone else." Alara felt a hot tear trace down her freezing cheek, and she finally turned to look into his storm-gray eyes. She saw the exact same devastating pain that she had carried inside her own shattered heart for 7 brutal years. She took a slow step closer, and the physical distance between them suddenly felt entirely unbearable. "I kept your old voicemails saved on my cracked phone," Alara confessed with a trembling breath. "I listened to your voice every single night in the dark just to survive the crushing loneliness of the slums." She told him his recorded laughter was the only thing that kept her sane when the debt collectors pounded on her door and the twins cried from hunger. They had both survived their agonizing separation by desperately holding onto the crumbling pieces of their past. Knox could not hold himself back for another single second. He closed the small gap between them, and his large hands gently cupped her freezing face. He leaned down and pressed his lips against hers in a desperate and heartbreaking kiss. The taste of her tears mixed with his own raw desperation and 7 years of agonizing distance instantly evaporated. Alara melted against his solid chest, and her hands gripped the fabric of his shirt like she was drowning in the intensity of his touch. It was a kiss built entirely on grief and survival and an unconditional love that had miraculously survived the darkest betrayals. But the phantom memory of his uncle's terrifying threats suddenly flashed behind Alara's closed eyelids. She gasped softly and placed her trembling hands flat against Knox's chest to push him gently away. She stepped backward and wrapped her arms around her own waist to shield her fragile heart. The intense physical connection was beautiful, but she knew they could not simply erase 7 years of deep trauma with one single kiss. Knox let his arms drop heavily to his sides, and he swallowed the sharp sting of rejection. He did not push her or demand that she surrender to the overwhelming chemistry burning between them. He simply nodded his head and looked at her with an infinite well of dark patience. "We are entirely broken," Alara whispered into the freezing wind. "We cannot just pretend the last 7 years did not completely destroy us both." She told him she needed time to learn how to exist in his dangerous world without waiting for the next terrifying ambush. Knox took one small step backward to give her the physical space she desperately needed. "I will wait another 7 years if that is what it takes," Knox promised with a fierce and absolute certainty. He swore he would spend every single day proving he was a shield for their family and not a weapon. They stood together on the freezing balcony and silently agreed to rebuild their shattered trust one agonizing step at a time. The fragile peace inside the sprawling mansion did not even last a full month. The morning sun had barely risen over the Chicago skyline when Tristan walked into the grand dining room with a face as pale as death. He carried a pristine black box carefully in his gloved hands. He told Knox the package had been left sitting directly inside the heavy iron gates. Someone had completely bypassed the first ring of their multi-million-dollar security system without tripping a single alarm. Knox stood up from the breakfast table, and a terrifying silence instantly swallowed the room. He ordered Alara to take the girls upstairs before he reached out and lifted the tight lid. The air in his lungs completely froze when he saw what was rusting inside the velvet lining. A delicate porcelain doll lay completely shattered at the bottom of the dark box. The doll had long black hair, and its painted eyes were the exact same storm gray color as Luna and Violet. But the most horrifying detail was the clean and violent cut that had completely severed the porcelain head from its small body. Knox felt the blood drain from his face as he noticed the glossy photographs tucked beneath the broken toy. He pulled the pictures out, and his hands began to shake with a murderous rage. The covert surveillance photos showed his 2 7-year-old daughters walking out of their highly secured private school. The camera angle was terrifyingly close, and it proved the photographer could have reached out and touched them. A small card rested at the bottom of the box with a single handwritten sentence. It warned the King of Chicago to be very careful with his beautiful new weaknesses. There was no signature, but Knox knew the twisted handwriting instantly. Vicente Castellano was his most brilliant and sadistic rival in the entire criminal underworld. Castellano had waited patiently for years to find a single crack in Knox's impenetrable armor, and now he had found 2. Knox threw the photographs onto the marble floor and went completely feral. He roared with a blinding fury and smashed his heavy fist directly through the solid oak dining table. He ordered Tristan to mobilize every single armed man in their syndicate and prepare to burn the entire city to ash. He wanted to drown the streets of Chicago in Castellano's blood before the sun went down. But before Knox could tear through the front doors and start a catastrophic war, Alara stepped directly into his destructive path. She had heard the violent crash from the top of the stairs, and she ran back down into the dining room. She did not flinch away from the terrifying mafia boss who was radiating pure and lethal violence. She stepped right in front of him and pressed her small hands firmly against his rapidly heaving chest. "You cannot do this," She ordered him with a voice that was absolutely steady and unshakable. Knox stared down at her with wild eyes and told her that a monster was threatening their daughters. He swore he would slaughter every single man in Castellano's organization to keep the twins safe. Alara gripped the lapels of his tailored shirt and forced him to look directly into her fierce gray eyes. "He is intentionally baiting you," she told him with a chilling and absolute clarity. "He wants you to lose your mind and run blindly into a trap so he can slaughter you in the streets." She reminded Knox that if he died in a reckless gang war, their daughters would be left entirely defenseless. The raw truth in her words acted like a bucket of freezing water over his blinding rage. She physically grounded the most dangerous man in Chicago by forcing him to remember his true purpose. He was not just a ruthless kingpin seeking violent revenge anymore. He was a father and a protector, and he had to use his brilliant mind instead of his trigger finger. Knox slowly closed his eyes and swallowed his feral wrath because he knew the woman he loved was absolutely right. Knox did not unleash his violent wrath upon the freezing streets of Chicago. He listened to the fierce woman he loved, and he completely locked down his entire criminal empire instead. The sprawling luxury estate instantly transformed into an impenetrable stone fortress of absolute paranoia. He deployed a rotating detail of 30 elite guards to patrol the perimeter every single hour of the day and night. 5 heavily armored SUVs sat idling in the circular driveway with their engines warm and their drivers ready for an immediate evacuation. The suffocating tension hung over the massive mansion like a thick and poisonous black cloud. Every shifting shadow outside the iron gates suddenly looked like a lethal assassin waiting to strike in the dark. Knox paced the polished marble floors of his grand study and waited for Vicente Castellano to make his first fatal mistake. He knew his sadistic rival desperately wanted him to panic, and he absolutely refused to give the monster exactly what he wanted. But Knox also knew the terrifying truth about the severed porcelain doll left in the pristine black box. Castellano could not have bypassed the multi-million-dollar estate security without a traitor working directly inside the Mercer syndicate. Knox unleashed his ruthless right-hand man Tristan to conduct a silent and bloody mole hunt through their own ranks. Tristan interrogated every single guard and driver who had access to the inner courtyard on the night the threatening package was delivered. The brutal and highly classified interrogations happened deep in the soundproof basement of the estate. The toxic paranoia quickly infected the entire crew and shattered their bonds of brotherhood. No one trusted the armed man standing next to him, and every whispered conversation was analyzed for signs of lethal betrayal. Knox watched the grainy security feeds from his dark office, and his storm gray eyes searched for any sign of hesitation among his most loyal soldiers. He was hunting a dangerous ghost inside his own home, and the invisible threat made his blood run completely cold. Despite the suffocating danger closing in around them, Knox knew he could not keep his innocent daughters locked inside the mansion forever. Violet was crying for her school friends, and the heavy isolation was beginning to break their fragile spirits. Alara fiercely argued that the girls needed to breathe real air, and Knox finally made the agonizing decision to let them leave the gates. He allowed the twins to return to their private school under a heavy blanket of extreme and covert surveillance. He did not send men in tailored black suits to walk them to the front doors like obvious targets for a sniper. He placed his deadliest operatives in unmarked utility vans across the street and disguised his best shooters as construction workers on a nearby roof. The girls walked through the crowded school gates with their heavy backpacks, and Knox watched them through a live satellite feed on his encrypted tablet. He was trying desperately to give his children a fleeting semblance of a normal life, while a bloody mafia war brewed just beneath the surface. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk until his knuckles turned completely white, and he prayed his invisible shield would hold against the coming storm. But Knox knew that even the most elite and heavily armed guards could be distracted or deceived in a chaotic moment of violence. He knew he needed an absolute fail-safe, and he found it in the sharp and cynical mind of his oldest daughter. The night before they returned to the classroom, he called Luna into his dimly lit study and securely closed the heavy oak doors. The 7-year-old girl walked into the room with her spine perfectly straight and her gray eyes sweeping the dark shadows for hidden danger. Knox did not speak to her like a fragile child who needed to be shielded from the ugly truth of their terrifying reality. He opened his locked desk drawer and pulled out a heavy black satellite phone that was entirely untraceable by any police or syndicate network. He placed the thick device into her small palms and told her it was programmed with exactly one single button. "Press this button and I will tear the entire world apart to find you," Knox promised with a deep and gravelly voice. Luna looked down at the heavy black phone and her small fingers slowly traced the single red button in the center. She did not ask him if they were in danger because the brilliant little girl from the freezing slums already knew the violent truth. She looked up at the terrifying mafia boss, and she saw the raw desperation bleeding through his hardened and scarred mask. Knox confessed that he trusted her brilliant survival instincts far more than he trusted his own heavily armed men. He told her she possessed the exact same cynical street smarts that had kept him alive on the lethal streets of Chicago for decades. "I understand," Luna replied with a chillingly calm voice that echoed the quiet dominance of her father. She carefully slipped the emergency phone deep into the hidden pocket of her plaid skull uniform and nodded her head exactly once. She did not smile, and she did not offer him any false comforts in the dark room. But the silent and intense exchange forged an unbreakable bond of absolute trust between the ruthless kingpin and his incredibly brilliant daughter. They both completely understood the terrifying stakes of the invisible game, and they were finally ready to play it together. The final school bell rang through the crisp Chicago air, and a sea of children flooded the front courtyard. Luna and Violet walked out toward the main gates with their heavy backpacks pulling at their small shoulders. They were supposed to wait exactly by the stone pillars for Tristan's armored black car to arrive. But a dark gray utility van suddenly screeched to a halt right at the edge of the sidewalk and completely blocked their view of the street. 8 tall men wearing tactical vests and navy windbreakers with federal agency letters printed on the back quickly stepped out of the heavy vehicle. They moved with a terrifying military precision that instantly bypassed the outer perimeter of Knox's undercover guards. The men did not look like police officers, and they did not walk like normal people. They fanned out across the crowded sidewalk and formed an impenetrable wall of bodies between the twin girls and the rest of the oblivious schoolyard. The tallest man in the tactical vest stepped directly in front of Violet and knelt down with a fake and sugary smile. He reached out his gloved hand and told the terrified little girl that her father had sent them because of a sudden family emergency. Violet looked up with wide gray eyes and took a hesitant step forward because the man spoke with absolute authority. But Luna possessed the exact same lethal street smarts as the ruthless king of Chicago. She saw the cold and dead look hiding right behind the stranger's plastic smile, and she knew instantly that Knox Mercer would never send an unmarked ban. Luna violently shoved her sister behind her own small body and formed a fierce shield against the imposing assassin. She jammed her trembling hand deep into her uniform pocket, and her small fingers pressed down hard on the single red button of the heavy satellite phone. She did not pull the device out where the dangerous men could see it or try to snatch it away. The hidden phone instantly opened a secure and untraceable audio line directly to her father's private network. Luna stood perfectly tall, and she projected her voice over the noise of the crowded street with a chilling clarity. "We are at the north gate of the school, and a man with a scar on his neck is trying to take us," Luna shouted loud enough for the hidden microphone to catch every single word. 10 miles away, inside a heavily guarded underground bunker, Knox was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table negotiating a tense syndicate treaty. The encrypted earpiece hidden in his right ear suddenly crackled to life, and his daughter's terrified but steady voice echoed directly into his brain. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, went completely feral in a fraction of a second. Knox stood up with a blinding roar and violently overturned the massive wooden table right in front of the stunned syndicate bosses. He did not say a single word of apology or explanation as he pulled his heavy weapons from his tailored jacket. He simply looked at Tristan and sprinted toward the armored garage with a murderous wrath that promised absolute destruction. 3 heavy armored SUVs tore through the crowded Chicago streets like black missiles. Tristan slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and the massive engine roared over the panicked blare of civilian horns. They bypassed every single traffic law and mounted the concrete sidewalks to avoid the gridlocked intersections. The 5-mile drive from the underground bunker took exactly 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Knox threw open his door before the heavy vehicle even skidded to a complete halt outside the skull gates. He hit the freezing pavement like an absolute force of nature, and his storm gray eyes immediately locked onto his terrified daughters. The 8 fake federal agents turned toward the screeching tires, but they were already completely outmatched. Tristan and the elite strike team poured out of the vehicles with military precision and lethal intent. The violent clash lasted less than 10 seconds, and it did not resemble a fair fight. Knox's men moved with terrifying efficiency and systematically dismantled the entire hit squad before a single shot could be fired. Heavy gun stocks shattered jaws and tactical boots crushed kneecaps against the concrete sidewalk. The 8 assassins were violently slammed to the ground and completely neutralized while the panicked school crowd scattered in absolute terror. Knox did not even glance at the bloody carnage unfolding right in front of the schoolyard gates. He completely ignored the groans of the broken men and the terrified screams of the civilian onlookers. He simply dropped his heavy weapons onto the concrete and let the expensive metal clatter against the freezing ground. He was the most feared kingpin in the entire city, but in that exact moment he was only a desperate father. Knox dropped heavily to his knees right in the middle of the chaotic sidewalk. He reached out with trembling hands and pulled both of his daughters violently into his solid chest. Violet immediately buried her face in his tailored jacket and sobbed uncontrollably into the expensive fabric. But Knox completely broke down and his broad shoulders shook with the overwhelming force of his own raw terror. Hot tears spilled out of his storm gray eyes and tracked down his scarred cheeks right in front of his hardened soldiers. He did not care about his lethal reputation or the terrified whispers of the crowd watching him weep. He just buried his face in their dark hair and thanked God that he had not arrived a single second too late. Then he felt 2 small and incredibly fierce arms wrapped tightly around his thick neck. Luna buried her face into the curve of his shoulder and her small body trembled against his chest. The fiercely independent girl from the freezing slums finally let her impenetrable armor shatter completely. She had spent 7 years protecting her sister and questioning every single adult who crossed her path. But Knox had kept his impossible promise, and he had torn the world apart to keep them safe just like he said he would. She squeezed her arms tighter around his neck, and her hot tears soaked into his color. "You came," Luna sobbed with a small voice that cracked with pure and overwhelming relief. "I knew you would come for us, Dad." The single word pierced straight through the freezing Chicago air and directly into Knox's completely shattered heart. The Ruthless Mafia boss held his brilliant daughter tighter, and he finally knew his family was completely whole. The heavy iron gates of the estate closed behind the armored vehicles and sealed the terrified family inside. Alara stood in the grand foyer and watched the most dangerous man in Chicago gently carry his exhausted daughters up the marble stairs. Knox Mercer was covered in the dust of the schoolyard and his expensive suit was completely ruined. But he held the sleeping twins against his broad chest as if they were the most precious diamonds in the entire world. Alara looked at the tears dried on his scarred cheeks and a profound epiphany suddenly crashed over her mind. She realized that she had spent 7 brutal years running from the phantom shadows of the criminal underworld. She had traded the suffocating danger of the mafia for the freezing horrors of extreme poverty and starvation. But the terrifying ambush at the school proved that absolute safety was nothing but a beautiful illusion. The dark world would always find a way to bleed into the light. She finally understood that Knox was not the lethal monster hiding under the bed. He was the impenetrable shield standing directly between her family and the wolves. Alara waited until the girls were tucked safely into their massive beds before she walked down to the dimly lit study. Knox was pouring a glass of amber whiskey with shaking hands when she pushed the heavy oak doors open. He looked up with storm-gray eyes that were still swimming in an ocean of lingering terror and guilt. But Alara did not offer him pity, and she did not retreat from the dark aura surrounding his desk. She walked straight across the Persian rug and placed her small hands directly over his trembling fingers. "I am completely done running away from you," Alara told him with a fierce and unwavering certainty. She looked into his devastated eyes and promised that she would rather stand by his side in the violent darkness than live another day without him in the light. She accepted every single part of his lethal empire because she knew his heart belonged entirely to their family. The breathtaking confession acted like a shot of pure adrenaline straight into Knox's exhausted veins. He pulled her fiercely into his chest and breathed in the scent of her hair like a drowning man finally breaking the surface of the water. Empowered by the absolute devotion of the woman he loved, Knox immediately shifted from a desperate father back into a terrifying kingpin. But he did not order his men to flood the Chicago streets with heavy weapons and innocent blood. He knew a chaotic shootout would only traumatize his daughters further and invite the federal authorities to tear his own empire apart. Knox unleashed his terrifying intellect instead of his trigger finger. He sat down at his mahogany desk and unlocked a secure digital vault hidden deep inside his private servers. He possessed the exact location of Vicente Castellano's hidden financial ledgers, and he knew exactly how to use them. Knox spent the entire night systematically dismantling his rival's encrypted network with surgical precision. He compiled a massive digital dossier detailing exactly $300 million in illicit money laundering and widespread political corruption. He did not send the explosive evidence to a corrupt local detective. He routed the heavily encrypted files directly to the highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The devastating counterattack was executed with absolute silence and lethal efficiency before the sun even began to rise. Knox coordinated a series of simultaneous and highly strategic strikes against Castellano's top lieutenants across the entire city. His elite enforcers did not fire a single bullet during the meticulously planned raids. They simply intercepted the rival capos in the dead of night and handed them over to the federal agents waiting in the shadows. Vicente Castellano was violently dragged out of his luxury penthouse in handcuffs while news helicopters circled the flashing police lights below. The sadistic monster who had threatened the Mercer twins watched his entire criminal organization evaporate into thin air in a matter of hours. The authorities seized the illegal casinos and the offshore bank accounts and the smuggled weapons caches all at once. Castellano was locked inside a federal holding cell facing consecutive life sentences without a single ally left to coal. Knox Mercer had completely destroyed his greatest enemy without spilling a single drop of blood on his expensive shoes. He proved to Alara and his daughters that he could rule the dark underworld without letting it consume their innocent souls. The violent storm over Chicago finally broke and left a profound peace over the sprawling Mercer estate. Knox took Alara by the hand and led her away from the laughing twins into the quiet sanctuary of his private study. He did not lock the heavy oak doors to keep danger out because the terrifying threats against their family were permanently neutralized. He walked over to the massive steel wall safe and entered a code he had memorized 9 long years ago. He reached deep inside the dark vault and pulled out a small box covered in faded red velvet. Knox turned around and slowly dropped to one knee right on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. He opened the velvet box to reveal a flawless diamond ring that perfectly caught the warm light of the desk lamp. He looked up into Alara's storm-gray eyes, and his deep voice trembled with the heavy weight of a decade of love and agonizing grief. "I bought this ring exactly 9 years ago to ask you to be my wife," Knox confessed with a raw and vulnerable honesty. "I kept it locked in the dark because I absolutely refused to ever give it to anyone else in this world." He asked her to stop being his beautiful ghost and finally let him be the husband and protector she truly deserved. Alara burst into tears of pure joy, and she whispered a fierce yes before pulling the ruthless kingpin up into a passionate kiss. The breathtaking spring wedding took place exactly 3 months later in the sprawling private gardens of the massive estate. Hundreds of delicate cherry blossoms drifted through the warm air like pale pink snow falling over the lush green lawns. The celebration was incredibly beautiful, but it was also guarded by 50 elite men standing silently along the high stone walls. Knox demanded the absolute certainty that his new family would remain completely safe on the most important day of their lives. Violet skipped down the long white aisles swinging a woven basket and tossing bright flower petals with a radiant and innocent smile. Luna walked carefully right beside her sister with her head held high and her cynical gray eyes finally shining with genuine happiness. They were the most beautiful flower girls in the entire city, and they wore matching dresses made of expensive white silk. Then the grand wooden doors opened and Alara stepped out into the warm sunlight looking like an absolute vision. The invisible waitress, who used to starve in the freezing slums, was now walking toward the altar as the untouchable and beloved Queen of Chicago. Knox watched his beautiful bride walk toward him, and he knew he had finally built an empire worth keeping. Their shattered past was finally healed by the undeniable power of an unconditional love that simply refused to die. The story of Knox and Alara teaches us that true family is never defined by blood or wealth or social status alone. It is defined by the fierce people who are willing to tear the entire world apart just to keep you completely safe. It reminds us that our deepest traumas do not have to dictate our future, and that even the darkest nights eventually surrender to the morning sun. We must always remember that true strength is not found in violence, but in the beautiful resilience of a mother fighting for her children. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this intense and emotional journey on Sunni romance. We always strive to bring you stories that touch your heart and remind you of the beautiful resilience of the human spirit. How did Alara's incredible sacrifice and Knox's ultimate redemption make you feel deep inside your own heart? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because we read every single one of your beautiful and inspiring messages. Do not forget to subscribe to Sunni Romance and share this video with someone who truly needs to believe in second chances. We wish you and your loved ones absolute peace, and we will see you again in the next story.